Okay, Henry, thank you very much for coming and talking to me. I heard you speak here at the Oxford Real Farming Conference yesterday, and there are a couple of points you made that I'd like to follow up.
Fantastic.
The first of which is you talked about international trade, and I've been talking to Minette Batters and the people from the NFU, and of course they're very worried about if we adopted higher standards of sustainability in our farming practices in order to meet zero net emissions by 2040, that the foreigners, the Americans in particular, would flood our country with cheap imports and therefore undercut the economic viability of our farming systems. And I think what you said yesterday was that you said more or less, over my dead body will I allow that to happen. And I'd like to know more about that, and also how you think it might be possible to prevent this trade in lower standard environmental, maybe in public health both, products flooding our markets.
Well, I think there are two stages to this, and it's not over my dead body. It's not as if I have unique power to stop this. I think it's over our dead bodies. I think for society, it is simply completely inconsistent, logically, and wrong to do all of the work, enormous amount of work that needs to be done in this country, not only to get to net zero, but to continue to regenerate our biodiversity, to stop pollution of our water with nitrogen, of our air with ammonia. There is a lot of work that we need to do to make our agricultural system a restorative system. And it is purposeless to do that if you just export those problems overseas in the form of imported food. Not only do you just move the problem from one place to another, but you also completely undercut the financial stability of our farming system. So I see it as being something that just makes no sense. And what's interesting about it is that has been the strong line of government when asked all the way through. But the question is, when push comes to shove in the negotiations, we need to be very clear as a society that that is something that we all strongly believe in. I'm actually optimistic. I don't think it would be politically possible to, at the last minute, do a deal that threw the environment, our very strong legacy, in carbon adaptation and mitigation, under a bus. But we need to be very clear that it is something that we will not tolerate.
Yeah, well, it's wonderful to hear you say that. And of course, you won't be surprised to hear I agree with you. And of course, you were appointed by Michael Gove, who famously said, I won't allow chlorinated chicken to come into this country. But I was with Dieter Helm last night, and this issue came up. And he said the political forces behind the trade negotiation with the US, amongst other countries, are going to be so powerful, and there'll be a quid pro quo deal, which there always is in trade deals. And of course, agriculture is always the area where the negotiations turn round. And he was pessimistic about a trade deal protecting the kind of outcomes from agriculture and the financial viability of the systems that we both want to see. So I just wondered, Boris. And
very, very. I mean, I worked as a journalist with him years and years and years ago.
I know Boris's dad. I'm
right,
a fan of Boris.
But I know Michael Gove very well. I've worked for him twice, and I know that he is very, very strong on this point. He genuinely believes that it's not a political frippery. I think that Dieter's right. So, and as we saw last year, when you get into negotiations, you worry that all sorts of things will be given away, be traded away, and that paranoia will get greater and greater as we go through this year. I think that what we can do, and we need to focus on what we can do, is continue to make the argument strongly, continue to show that we support the government, we support these politicians in their view that this is a line they won't cross. Therese Villiers, our DEFRA Secretary of State, said it yesterday, and just continue to make that case. I'm not sure, we each need in society to play the roles we can play in that.
Yeah, well,
Fish is the other one. So fish is the other one that people are very worried about. So I am very bullish that actually we can create conservation zones around the UK that show the world again. Our role is showing the world what can be done.
Well,
and there's work in deference going on that's fantastic. I'm bullish about that, but people are, rightly, I think, worried, paranoid. We need to keep those arguments going. We need to get that pressure up.
Yeah, well, you asked for help with this yesterday, and I'm offering ours because I was introduced to the woman who is heading up the negotiating team for the US recently, and when the conversation opened, I met her at the American Embassy, and she said chlorinated chicken, and I said, no, let's talk about trade in sustainably produced foods and find a way where we can assess the sustainability of both the foods that we produce in this country and the imported foods. And if we had that common framework and metrics for measuring that, then we could say to the importer, I'm sorry, your production standards are lower than ours in terms of carbon emissions or other sustainability factors. You will have to pay a tariff or a tax in order to get access to our market.
And I don't think also it's not black or white. It's not either no trade or environmental destruction. So, for example, you will know that the organic standards for dairy are stronger in the United States than they are here. They have a zero tolerance on antibiotics. I met the USDA representative as well, actually. I've met her a couple of times. I met her at the organic OMSCO, the Organic Milk Cooperative Board, and she pointed out to me that there is a vast amount of chicken within the US that isn't chlorine washed. So I don't think it doesn't strike me from having done deals in the commercial sector that the quid pro quo necessarily needs to be completely agreeing to one country's standards or the other. You might say we can export organic milk to the States, but it needs to be to their standards.
Well, I'll tell you what,
and they can export chicken to us, but it needs to be to our standards. That, to me, is one of the possible outcomes.
Well, maybe you can use your influence, and I can use what influence I have, and the two of us can sort of shoe into the conversation where the trade negotiation takes place to make sure that the wrong outcome doesn't happen. Because I tell you one person who would be very interested in that, and that's Minette Batters, because she, I think, is a great leader of the NFU, but she's got to look after her rank and file, and many of them, and this is the other thing I want to explore with you, many arable farmers throughout the United Kingdom are very, very interested in switching towards more sustainable methods of production. But they are very worried about whether they can make their farming systems economically viable if they introduce the necessary measures. And I know that you understand about rotational farming and switching to soil carbon building through rotation rather than nitrogen fertilizer. But of course, if you do that on an arable farm, it means that almost as night follows day, you need to introduce a livestock enterprise, normally a sheep or a beef or a dairy cattle enterprise, because they're the ones that can digest the grass, which is in the fertility building phase. And as you well know, and as we are about to discuss here at the Oxford Farming Conference this afternoon with George Monbiot, there is a tide running against the consumption of red meat, even grass-fed meat, as sales are in the doldrums at the moment. And I wondered what hope and encouragement you could offer farmers that are thinking about switching towards more sustainable production, because obviously you're in a position where you can influence their incomes.
So, as I said in the speech yesterday, this is a debate which has a lot of heat and very little light. It is quite a complex debate. The difference between feedlot systems in the States or feedlot systems in Brazil on land cleared of rainforest in terms of carbon footprint of that is very different from beef raised on permanent pasture, which is very different again from beef raised in agroecological rotations. And what we plan to do in the interim report is to be really clear about the impacts of all of these systems, also thinking about the soy fed to pork and poultry and animal welfare. And I cannot see, if you look at the amount of beef that is required to in those agrological rotations, just the quantity of beef that's being raised in these systems as a percentage of the global total, it is tiny. So I can't see a situation where that would be hurt. I just can't see it.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, but certainly, I mean, you probably know this, but beef consumption last year went down by 15% in the UK. and lamb consumption continues to fall, whereas chicken consumption continues to
Go
rise, which is
Yeah.
a terrible irony because, of course, intensive chicken production is the least sustainable of all livestock systems. So I'm hoping that you might start sending up those kind of messages.
Well, we're going to be really clear on the impact of all of it. I think the difficult thing with beef is, so the reason, and people don't normally mention this, but because no one gets into the detail, but the reason that everyone is focusing on, the climate people are focusing on beef, is despite the fact that methane comes out of the atmosphere within 12 years and therefore breaks down. So if you have a given herd, you're not adding to global warming, you're maintaining the same atmosphere because they're just rotating the methane. It is 38 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. So if you are trying to apply a brake, if you're trying to apply a brake to global warming, methane is a very obvious target. So that is why it's so heated compared to all the other things. Anything you do to reduce carbon, you're reducing, whereas methane people see as a brake. And it strikes me that it would be a good thing for both planetary health and dietary health if we were to reduce the amount of beef grown in feedlot systems and stop pulling down the rainforest. The question is, how do you stop one but allow the continuation of the other? That's where this debate
we
becomes
need
really
to differentiate between the two,
Yes.
both in terms of defining them and measuring the
Yes.
different systems,
Exactly.
but also we need to give the public information about the beef or
Yes,
the lamb that they're buying,
exactly.
what system of production it comes from.
Exactly.
And if you can help do both of those things in your recommendations, that would be enormously helpful, because at the moment, let's be honest, if you go into a supermarket, it's incredibly hard to differentiate between all these different...
It is. So I, for example, buy, for my children, I always buy grass-fed beef, but it is really difficult. So you have to find out what is properly grass-fed rather than fed a little bit of grass and then fed a lot of soy. It's difficult. It's very difficult to find that out as a consumer. It's almost impossible. I found a couple of suppliers where I know that that's the case, but it's tough.
Well, obviously, if even you, and I would agree with you completely, people who have a sophisticated understanding of these issues find it difficult to source those products, then for most people most people living a busy life hearing beef, vegan, it's impossible. So we need to make that. Part of the job needs to be to make that easier to understand. Exactly, and I hope that that's the sort of area we can be working in, because obviously, as you also said yesterday, policymakers can do so much, but if they're not getting help from the marketplace, that makes your job very much more difficult. So let's make sure that we can join up the measures that you're encouraging the government to introduce to change the economic environment through policy intervention, and to make sure that people who buy food can use their buying power in the same direction.
Well, I think the fundamental question we need to ask ourselves, it's not about the farmers, it's not about what Minette wants, it's about what we want to be as a country. And I think we are pretty clear that as we break free from the European Union, what we need to be is a country that leads the way on showing how we can restore our environment, that leads the way on showing how we can sequester carbon, and that then hopefully exports that knowledge abroad. 18 countries already have copied our climate change committee structure. We should be hoping that people copy us in our food and farming system. And that can only be by setting ourselves the highest standard, and by setting the highest standard on foods that are important to this country.
Well, I absolutely agree with that, and thank you very much for talking with me, and let's see if we can develop the equivalent of a sort of COP for food, because in a way that would provide the leadership that is necessary to make sure that countries throughout the world see that transforming their food and farming systems is going to make a crucial contribution to addressing climate change.
Thank you.